another key attribute which is important when we are writing scientific reports is the idea of correct formatting and presentation. Now, when you are thinking about this, you're thinking, well, why is this so important? I'm sure to a degree you can kind of ascertain it, that we clearly, as a society and a culture, don't like things to be necessarily messy and out of order, but sometimes I suspect it feels like it's a little bit pedantic what is perhaps being asked for. But again, the theme that is fundamental to science in terms of communication is avoiding ambiguity. And the idea of using set structures in the way we present our work, our findings, and communicate is about taking that ambiguity out. So, for example, you might question why we have margins and specific margin dimensions. Well, the obvious answer for that is, for example, if it was actually a bound piece of work, so use a spiral bound piece of work, the margins are used because it's to avoid the binding actually overlaying the writing. So we follow those kind of guidelines. But it's also about, can you follow simple instructions? That is a fundamentally important aspect of being able to work scientifically. And so these instructions are really important to us in terms of both can we follow them, but also taking the ambiguity out of what we do. So it is this, can you reduce the ambiguity? So one of the things that you need to think about is that for any piece of work, or if you're submitting a paper to a journal, for example, or you're submitting an abstract to a conference, they will provide you with guidelines. There is no example where guidelines will not be provided, and they are provided for particular reasons. They may be that they are the guidelines of the organisation. If it's their conference, it may be ACSM's guidelines or BASE's guidelines. If it's for a journal, different journals conform to different guidelines based upon what their publishing organisation deems. So, for example, if you were to submit to the Journal of Sports Sciences or the European Journal of Sports Sciences, they're both published by Taylor and Francis. Taylor and Francis have particular guidelines in terms of the way you format your submission. Were you to submit to, say, MedSci Sport and Exercise, which is published by Lippincott has different guidelines. So you have to understand what these guidelines are. So first thing you do is you always go and check what the guidelines are going to be. So so let's look at the guidelines as an example to think about this. So the guidelines that you're seeing here are the guidelines in relation to a level 5 piece of work, which is this example that these videos are linked to. So the guidelines stipulate that the work has to be double-line spaced, but it also stipulates that the abstract should not be double-line spaced. And in fact, actually, the abstract is 1.5 line spaced. So no good doing them all single-lined or doing them all double-lined. That is not what the guidelines are. Margins should all be set at 2.54 centimetres. Well, that's actually the standard setting in Word. One of the things to notice is if you've got headers and footers on tables, they are only single line space. Requirements now very much in any assignment or any publication about using dyslexic friendly fonts. So for example, we know that fonts like Arial, Calibri, Bookman, Daytona, or actually what is the ARU font, which is Railway, are described as dyslexic friendly fonts. So not using fonts like Times New Roman, for example. Check what the font size is. So for this example here, the font size is 11. But there is also a requirement that says actually in the headers and the footers, so that's tables and figures, it should be font size 9, but in bold. Other things to think about is the use of subscripts and superscripts. So we use subscripts and superscripts primarily really when we are denoting units and so on. But don't intermix them. So there are two ways to present units. You can either have what we have here, which is mils per kilogram per minute using dot to the -1. And that means per. Or you can use the backslash approach. But what you can't do is have mils per kilogram minus 1 dot min minus 1. You can't intermix them, it's one or the other. And the other thing is make sure that you use SI units throughout. So that's the scientific way of presenting units. So make sure that you're using, for example, kilograms and not pounds. You're using centimeters, not inches. You're using the correct units. For example, if you're talking about forces, you really should be referring to things like newtons or newton meters in that example. And the spelling has to be UK English, not UK American. And that's not just a kind of a guideline for an assignment in the UK. Actually, that's a guideline in terms of all scientific communication. The SI form of communication, that is the agreed language of communication, is UK English. So you need to set that in Word. So let's have a look at these in action and just kind of connect all the dots up. So here we've got the requirements for this piece of work, the assignment. So you can see that this ties together with what actually is written on that previous piece of information. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is don't be frightened to also go into the marking criteria and just look inside. What else is being asked in terms of formatting? So, for example, you may be looking at formatting in relation to the way you present your results. So here, it connects to the kind of the previous video, which you may have watched, and if you haven't, go and watch it, which is on how to kind of present tables and figures. Axis on graphs, no grid lines, no title on the figures, independent variable always on the x-axis, figure headings. This is all to do with formatting, the way we format our work. So go and check all the time. Same with, for example, when you're presenting data. So for example here, making sure that you're presenting it appropriately, using the p-value correctly, that you're using the mean and standard deviation or the standard error. So all of these things kind of align to what we mean in terms of formatting. So let's just see this briefly in the report. So here we are in the report. You can see that it is double line spaced in terms of the main body of the report, but as the guidelines have instructed us, it is 1.5 line spaced for the abstract. Notice that the font is a dyslexic friendly font. This is Railway, and that the font size is in fact font size 11. So you can see here that we've got font size 11 that has been highlighted. In the results section, notice that we're using the appropriate formatting for our units. So we've got SI units here in terms of kilograms. That is the SI unit that we need to use in relation to this data. But also we're using the correct formatting for our statistical outputs. The formatting requires that we have font size 9 in bold for our tables and figures, which you can see quite clearly here. The same with the figures here in terms of we've got this font size 9 in bold. So it's important that you read those instructions. It takes away the ambiguity in what we are doing when we are communicating. It is not about somebody being pedantic and trying to make your task harder. In fact, they're trying to make your task easier by giving you clear guidelines to follow.